The contemporary period presents challenges to world history teaching. As we look at developments over the past century, we must be careful to maintain contact with earlier patterns and with characteristics of individual major civilizations and with earlier processes in world history. Now, in studying change in the contemporary period, we risk ignoring the fact that this period does not stand in isolation to the past. Now, although the contemporary period is new, some features such as the cultural, political, economic, and military power of the West are carryovers from the long 19th century and even earlier. The world economy also persisted in some ways, and modernization blossomed further in this period. Now, two key issues in dealing with the contemporary period involve the currency and complexity of developments over the past century, and the fact that we do not know the end of the story. Now, we can point to changes from patterns in the long 19th century, but we cannot always say that new patterns are well established, and we cannot make final determinations about new directions. The 20th and early 21st centuries are usually divided into three phases. The years 1914 to 1945 were dominated by two world wars, the Depression, disarray in Western society, stirrings in other societies, and the force of new revolutions, particularly in the Soviet Union. The years 1945 to 1990 were marked by the Cold War, which provides an alternative to the main frame of reference that applied to the World War and interwar period. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, we enter the third phase of the contemporary era, marked perhaps by the emergence of the United States as the world's only superpower. Now, along with some questions about how long that role would last. The two world wars posed new questions about the Western role in the world, particularly in the Western European role. Now, we see a decline of Western Europe in world affairs, particularly after World War II, and this decline opened a transitional framework in which the Soviet Union and the United States disputed world dominance. Now, that transitional system failed, and the Cold War became a first statement about how to address the shifting world power balance. In the third phase of the contemporary era, we are involved in more open-ended questions about what the new power structure will be. Now, it's important to remember that the contemporary period is still a recent one in world history. Some of the details have yet to be worked out, and some of the new themes have yet to be fully established. So what are the new themes in the contemporary period? The dominant social class in most societies in 1900 or 1914 was still the landed aristocracy. Now, by the early 21st century, the aristocracy is almost gone, replaced by a new kind of professional middle class. This social class thinks of the world more in industrial than in agricultural terms, more in urban terms than in rural, and more in managerial structures than in terms of private land ownership. In 1900 or 1910, the world's major political regimes were predominantly monarchies or empires, but these systems are largely gone in the early 21st century. The alternatives include democracies, along with authoritarian regimes and communist systems. Gender relationships also seem to enter a new phase in the contemporary era. Old systems of patriarchy were modified by efforts to give women the vote, improve their educational levels, and provide them with some legal rights. The gender system that would replace the patriarchal system, however, has not been clearly defined, and the new system is not completely egalitarian and does not fully address the women's economic role or the issue of male violence against women. The contemporary period is partly defined by shifts in gender relations, but the themes here have not been fully established once again. Now, the contemporary period offers a new set of challenges to older cultural beliefs. These challenges come from communism, a greater mass appeal of nationalism, consumerism, and science. In important ways, these cultural options do not entirely agree with one another. and by the early 21st century, these options had not fully succeeded in displacing the old. The cultural map of the contemporary period is also complicated. We cannot say for sure that the older patterns have been vanquished completely. Now, in defining the contemporary period, we must look at the shift away from dominant patterns of the long 19th century and to some extent aspects of the early modern period. We begin by looking at the relative decline of the West, for which we see evidence beginning in World War I. Now, both world wars, apart from their global dimensions, can be seen as a giant internal civil war within the West. In this conflict, the West's inability to maintain its power position in the world accelerated as a result of the economic, political, and population damage Western societies influence on one another. Now, the measurements of relative decline important here are found in the military and in the West's capacity to control most other parts of the world. In the early 21st century, the West still possessed the greatest military power in the world as a whole, but the capacity of the West to move almost at will militarily had been curtailed by the second half of the 20th century. One reason for this was that Western countries became less willing to invest heavily in maintaining cutting-edge military technologies. Several other parts of the world began to emphasize military tactics that could stalemate the West's advantage in conventional armament, such as guerrilla warfare in Vietnam or the resistance in urban settings seen in Algeria and Iraq. As individual countries gained independence and a measure of economic success, they invested in military force. The West could still defeat such countries, but doing so took much more planning and economic commitment than previously. We also see the decline in the West's capacity to control most of the rest of the world directly through colonies and colonial administrations. One key development in the contemporary world, starting between the wars and accelerating after World War II, was decolonization. Western political and economic influence could survive decolonization in some cases, but the world as a whole saw a much reduced capacity of any single civilization or society to dominate global politics. Now, some people argue that the relative decline of the West will ultimately yield predominance to another civilization, but there's no inherent reason that a pattern of successive dominance must repeat itself. Several other themes began to gain ascendancy in the contemporary period. In future centuries, people may see the fundamental innovation of the contemporary period as the beginning of humankind's conquest of outer space. Now, in the early 21st century, however, space exploration has not yet had a deep impact on human life or the patterns of global societies. Another candidate for the contemporary period's fundamental innovation is the altered nature of war and military technology in the 21st century. The two world wars introduced the concept of total war, the mobilization of all the major resources of the key combatants, not just armies and navies, but the economy and civilians as well. World War II gave birth to the capability to end human existence with nuclear weapons. And among the new themes of the contemporary era were the tightened organizational capacity in war, society's insistence on total surrender as a result of their investment, and the threat of devastating and fearsome new technology. Another theme of the contemporary period is a massive global population increase. The population growth carries over into other features that begin to shape or reshape the world. World population explosion encourages new patterns of immigration, bringing together people from different cultural backgrounds and leading to new challenges in many societies. Now, population explosion also places unprecedented stress on global environments. The final defining theme involves the steady acceleration of communication and transportation technologies. Important developments here include radio, satellite communications, the internet, and air travel. Now, these technologies offer unprecedented opportunities and in some ways pose unprecedented threats and challenges to the identities of individual societies. The accelerated movement of ideas, goods, and peoples, sometimes referred to as globalization, is an indisputable mark of the new period of world history. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to turn to changes in the world economy, where we will find echoes of the themes we've discussed here, and again, significant change, but no certainty about the outcomes.